Welcome to the Joseph Goldstein Insight Hour. This podcast is an expression of our shared interest in self-discovery. Join Joseph as he shares his deep knowledge of the path of mindfulness. If you are interested in supporting this podcast, please go to BeHereNowNetwork.com/Joseph.
Well, hello, everyone. It's really good to be with you all, even if it is via Zoom. So today, I would like to address a very simple question, which at one point or another may have occurred to you. And the question is, why meditate? Why am I doing this? Is it about reducing stress, having greater ease in our lives, or is there something more? In the opening lines of the Dhammapada, which is, as you know, one of the collections of the Buddha's teachings in verse, the very first line of the first verse says, "Mind is the forerunner of all things." So that immediately gives us a clue as to why meditate. Mind is the forerunner of all things. And here mind means more than just thoughts or intellect. Mind, in the Buddhist sense, consciousness, is the basic capacity to know, to be aware. And it also includes all of the different qualities of mind, which in Buddhism are called mental factors, which arise in every moment of consciousness, coloring that awareness in a whole variety of ways. So, for example, concentration, love, restlessness, boredom, joy, happiness, compassion, all of these are mental factors, qualities, rise at different times, and they color the consciousness according to their own particular nature. So these qualities that are arising in the mind are the manifestation of our own particular conditioning, what we have either knowingly or unknowingly cultivated in the course of our lives. You know, have we cultivated love? Have we cultivated aversion? Have we cultivated fear or joy? So our mind is the manifestation of all of this conditioning that we are all manifesting in the way we live. And this conditioning sometimes manifests in sometimes unusual ways, because the same experience of sights or sounds or tastes or sensations in the body, different people may have very different reactions to the very same stimulus, depending on their particular conditioning. So I had one very striking example of this early on when I met my first teacher, Munindraji, in India. He loved hot chili peppers. The hotter, the better. And so we'd be eating together and he would be having these hot chili peppers. And once I just tasted a little bit of one, my whole mouth was on fire. It was burning. And I asked Munindraji, do you really enjoy these? Because the experience seemed so unpleasant. And he explained in his way of understanding, the hot chili peppers were very good for health. So the way he was experiencing it, even though the stimulus, which to me was very painful and unpleasant, he had it in the context, oh, I'm doing something really good for my body here. This is healthy. And so he was enjoying them. And it just struck me because it was such a good example of how we each filter our experience through our own particular background, our own particular conditioning. So when we say mind is the forerunner of all things, it's more than an abstract philosophical principle. What we do, how we feel, all of our aspirations, all of our regrets, they're all expressions or manifestations of the mind. The mind is the forerunner of all things. So I was first introduced to intensive meditation practice when I went to India, to Bodh Gaya. This goes back a long time, 50 years or more. And I met my teacher, Munindraji, and he said something when I first met him that totally captured my interest. And I was young at that time. I was just, I think, 23 years old. I knew very little about Buddhism. But when I first met him, he said something so simple. He said, if you want to understand your mind, sit down and observe it. The common sense of it was so striking to me. There was nothing to join. There were no rituals. There were no ceremonies. Nothing. If you want to understand your mind, sit down or in any posture and observe it. Because how else could we understand our minds except by doing that? So again, this is another response to the question of why meditate. So we come to an understanding of our own minds. As we do this, even from the very beginning, there's one insight of insight meditation which becomes immediately apparent. So if there are some of you who are wondering, well, I've been practicing insight meditation and I'm still waiting for the insights to come. Well, you've all had this first insight. And that is noticing how often the mind wanders. Has anybody not had that insight? I think not. Because, we give it this very simple object of meditation. It might be the breath or certain sensations in the body. And then very quickly, the mind hops on these trains of association. And pretty soon our mind is off in some completely other place. It's like we hop on the train. We don't know that we've hopped on. And because we didn't buy the ticket, we don't even know where the train is going. And so after some time, we find ourselves by the end of that particular thought train, we could be in a whole different inner mental environment because of this wandering mind. So again, in answering the question, why meditate? One response might be, well, it's just to make sense of all of this. As we begin to look at our minds, to observe it and see everything the mind is doing, it can be confusing. There's so much going on. So we meditate to come out of the confusion, to come out of all our habitual reactions into a space of greater wisdom, of greater clarity. We begin to see much more clearly what actually is going on in our experience rather than being lost in it. We begin to see what it is that's shaping our lives. So the first step in this whole process through meditation is calming the mind and collecting the attention. So it's really strengthening the steadiness of mind, the ability or the capacity for the mind to stay steady on whatever we're attending to. When we do this, instead of unknowingly hopping on all these chains of associations, we become much more aware more quickly of when the mind is lost in a thought, when we're carried away by different feelings and emotions, and when we're actually being mindful of them. And even just this very simple thing, being aware of when we're lost and then when we're actually being mindful, really highlights for us what mindfulness means. And this is why sometimes in practice, I really encourage people, when we're lost in a thought and then wake up from being lost, to pay attention to that very moment of waking up. So lost, and then, thinking. Right there in that moment, instead of either judging ourselves, lost again, we can actually have delight in the fact that we're now awake and have a very clear sense of what wakefulness means, what awareness means. Because we've just gone from being deluded to being awake. So one piece of encouragement here is that for as many times as you get lost in thought, that many times do you awaken. So why not delight in all those moments of awakening rather than judging oneself for having been lost? That was a little aside. For me, that moment of transition is really powerful, and it's one that we often just pass over. We don't highlight that moment and what can be learned from it. So at first, we may notice and become mindful most easily of kind of the loudest thoughts or the longest stories that we're engaged in, or the more dramatic emotions. Of course, given the state of the world, these may be coming with greater and greater frequency these days. But what's interesting that both in stillness meditation and in walking meditation, and also in our daily lives, we may be missing the more frequent but quickly passing thoughts, the lighter ones. And I had a really interesting experience of this recently, a few years ago, on a self-retreat. I was just going for a walk, but with the intention and application of being mindful as I was going to the walk. So it wasn't the Vipassana creep of lift, move, place. It was just walking at a, more or less normal pace, but being mindful as I could. What was so surprising to me in doing that, and this is after many years of practice, how many quickly passing thoughts would arise even in terms of one step. And in those moments, even though they were quickly passing, in the moment that they were going on, I was not mindful of them because they were so light. They were underneath my radar. So this was really interesting to me, this undercurrent of thought. So I want to read just a little teaching from Dujum Rinpoche, who was one of the great Tibetan masters of the last century, because it really points to this experience and the importance of becoming aware of this undercurrent of thought. This is what he wrote. When you are meditating, it is easy to identify your coarse thoughts when they arise suddenly. But until a few of your subtle thoughts have arisen and are recognized, you do not know that they are there. These are called the undercurrent of thought. And I love this next phrase. They are the sneaky thieves of meditation. And for that reason, it is very important to post the guard of mindfulness. So I love this, the thieves of meditation, because we think we're meditating. We think we're being mindful. And yet and we are to some or even a large extent, but underneath, there are these pretty frequent arising of these light thoughts. And what's interesting is that for me, I saw so many of them in one way or another were referencing a sense of self. It could be a plan or a memory or a comment or a judgment. And so unknowingly, with these thieves of meditation, we're reinforcing this view of self, this view of I. And so I really began to appreciate with interest, it really captured my interest to watch not only in times of meditation, formal, but throughout the day, just to notice the many times these undercurrents of thoughts are present. And that is one way of tremendously deepening our practice. We're dropping down to a more subtle level. We're training the quality of our attention. You're refining the quality of our attention. So one example of the impact of this undercurrent of thought, the example that came to my mind when I began to observe it in myself, it felt like the soundtrack of a movie or a TV show. And this is probably a fairly common experience. When I'm watching a movie, sometimes I can be so absorbed in the story that I'm not even consciously aware of the soundtrack, the music in the background. And yet that soundtrack is powerfully manipulating our emotions. The music is a certain way and we get tense, or another way and we feel happy or light. So all of this is going on in the background and we're hardly even aware of it. And yet it's having this tremendous impact on our lives. This is the same, and this is why I'm emphasizing so much and why it's been of such interest to me to really emphasize within our practice of mindfulness, keeping an eye out for these very light thoughts. Sometimes it can be really amusing because we become aware of these random thoughts that just pop up in the mind. One time I was on retreat with Sayadaw Pandita. It was in Australia. And as many of you know, he was a very strict and demanding teacher, and everybody was really trying to be impeccably mindful. We were online for lunch, and I was second online. We're going through the lunch line, and the person in front of me reaches the table with the food. He takes the lid off the pot and puts it down, but as he put the lid down, it fell to the floor and made this big clattering noise in the midst of all this silence. And the first thought in my mind, just in that moment, was, it wasn't me. I mean, a sense of humor about one's mind is essential in this whole path of practice. Because as one yogi told me in an interview once, as he was observing his mind, he said, I've discovered the mind has no pride. It will do anything. But we do not have to be caught by it all. right? We don't have to be identified. If we're aware of it, we can really have a sense of humor about everything the mind is doing. So with this attention to the nature of our mind and what's arising in our thoughts or emotions, we also begin to get very clear about the deeply conditioned particular habit patterns that have been developed over the course of our lives and that are driving our lives. So, for example, are the conditioned patterns that we see come up again and again? Is it obsessive planning? Is it worry? Is it anxiety? Is it the judging mind, either of ourselves or others? Are our actions motivated by generosity, by love? Or are they motivated by desire or by anger? Or probably some combination of them all. So again, this investigation and understanding, this is not a theoretical exercise. Through the mindfulness of them all, it's showing us so clearly how we're leading our lives. So instead of just acting out mechanically the patterns of our conditioning, we're really beginning to see what's going on. In whatever we do, we might ask the question, what quality of heart and mind, what qualities are being cultivated? What is becoming habituated? What is being strengthened? And what makes this entire exploration so transformative, and this understanding is what imbues our practice with tremendous power. It's the profound realization that we have agency in this whole process. So it's not that we're condemned to just act out all the patterns of our conditioning. As we cultivate mindfulness and we see with greater clarity what's going on and not so lost and carried away by it, that's when we can exercise some discerning wisdom and say, okay, what's skillful? What should be cultivated? What's not skillful? What should I let go of? Through the power of mindfulness, we begin to see that our minds can be trained. So this is a tremendous understanding, because I think most people in the world don't understand that. We're just living our lives and we are who we are and we act it all out without the understanding that the mind is a dynamic process that can be trained. And it's mindfulness of what's going on in our minds that allows us to make wise choices. So the question then for all of us is, trained for what? Right? We're transformed, but transformed in what way? So again, the Buddha, in one statement, he pointed out, in one very simple statement, he pointed out the various possibilities when he said, our minds can be our best friend or our worst enemy. And I think we've all had experiences of both of those. When the mind is in a wholesome state, it becomes our best friend. And when the mind is in an unwholesome state, especially in an extreme case, it can become our worst enemy. So with this understanding, we see the causes of either great happiness and fulfillment in our lives or the causes of great suffering, and the realization we have agency in that. So that's a powerful recognition. So, as another answer to the question, why meditate, we can say, to make our minds our friend. And I love that. What could be a more intimate friendship than friendship with our own hearts and minds? What I so appreciate about the Buddha's teachings is the clarity with which he sorted all this out. I'm often struck by, in meditation, we give the mind a simple, I'll just be with the breath. And it's hard enough just to do that, to link together 5 or 10 breaths, with strong mindfulness. And yet the Buddha was able to see the entirety of the mind and all the ways it manifests. And he saw it with such clarity. It's like he gave us a map. And this is one you're very familiar with, I think. He taught, and we can see for ourselves, when we act motivated by greed or by hatred or by delusion, suffering follows. And when we act motivated by generosity or by love or by wisdom, it's the source of happiness in our lives. So it's in this regard that His Holiness the Dalai Lama said, everything rests on the tip of motivation. In our investigation of our own experience, of our own hearts and minds, we need to really focus and understand and become aware of the motivations behind our actions. But this is not so easy to do. We might understand on an intellectual level, yes, motivation is really an important aspect, and that understanding aligns with our values. But how often do we actually apply it in our lives? In the midst of our daily lives, do we stop and reflect before we act? Oh, what's the motivation here? Probably not that often, because motivations can be very subtle, and sometimes hard to see. They're often mixed. Here, there's a powerful intersection between the understanding that everything rests on the tip of motivation and our mindfulness practice. Because while in the course of our normal lives, motivations may be hard to pick up if we haven't trained ourselves, we can, in meditation, through mindfulness, through practicing being mindful of motivations, we get a lot more skilled in becoming aware of them, even outside of meditation, just as we're living our lives. So there's one arena of activity of life in which I found to be very fruitful for beginning this exploration of motivation. And that is the whole arena of speech. Now, of course, not when you're on a silent meditation retreat, but in the midst of our daily lives, we speak a lot. In terms of all the interactions we have in a day, speech is a very prominent part of our life experience. And just as an aside, one of the many lists in Buddhism are the 10 wholesome and unwholesome actions. Of the 10, 4 of them have to do with speech. So that's the importance that the Buddha gave to being mindful and aware and discernment about our speech and the motivation behind it. So again, as many of you know, he outlined 4 types of wrong speech, lying, backbiting, gossip, and useless talk. And I'm not a Pali scholar, but the word in Pali for useless talk is my favorite Pali word. Sampapalapa. Because it sounds just like what it is. And I have found that to be, as well as the other 3, of course, such an interesting place to practice. I can be hanging out with friends just in a social situation. We're just hanging out and conversing. And so often, I can see in my mind an impulse to say something that is totally useless. It has no bearing on anything, except perhaps to say, here I am, announcing my presence. At those times when I can see that impulse, the motivation to sampapalap, and I'm mindful enough to refrain, it always feels great. It feels, oh yeah, that would have been really useful. It feels like it's a conservation of energy rather than a dissipation of energy. So again, this is, I was going to say humorous, or it's a fun way of playing because we really have a direct application of seeing the importance of being mindful of our motivation before we speak or before we act. So what's so significant about this whole process, the whole process of exploring our minds and our actions, is that none of it depends on blind belief or dogma. And again, this is one of the things that first attracted me to the Buddhist teachings. It was not about, he wasn't saying, come, you must believe this. It was always framed in, come and see, come and investigate for yourself. This is my understanding coming out of my realization of what brings happiness and what causes suffering. Check it out. And I love that because then our entire lives become the laboratory of our understanding. We're testing out in ourselves, for ourselves, in our own experience. Okay, so there's really focusing, giving emphasis to becoming aware of motivation before our actions. Another arena of investigation of our minds, of our experience, which I found hugely helpful in my practice and in my life, and I've talked about this a lot in these last few years. It's condensed in one phrase, which I now use a lot. Don't waste your suffering. Don't waste your suffering. Although external circumstances in our lives, of course, will impact our experience. And sometimes there are very troublesome or even harmful or unpleasant experiences that come in the course of a lifetime. No one is exempt from that. But how we relate to those experiences are completely up to us. No one makes us relate to difficult, feelings or emotions or situations, no one makes us relate to them in a particular way. That's totally within our capacity to see, okay, how can I relate to this in a wise way? So it doesn't mean that unpleasant things are going to stop happening to us from time to time, or even frequently. But it does mean that we can train ourselves and learn to relate to these unpleasant experiences, whatever they may be, in the body or in our emotions or relationships. How we relate to them is up to us. So one example of this is, again, one of my favorites, is from the Zen master poet Ryokan. And he lived, I think, in the 1800s, something like that. And he was this, monk in Japan, lived alone in the mountains, very poor, and he wrote a lot of haiku and poetry, and he would wander around, play with the village children, and wonderful stories about his life. So he lived in this kind of ramshackle hut, up in the mountains someplace, very few possessions. One day he came back to his hut and everything had been stolen. So what did he do? He wrote a haiku. The moon at the window. The thief left it behind. Now I wonder how we would be if we came back to our house and everything was stolen. Would we be writing haikus? Oh, the moon at the window. I'm so glad the thief left it. Probably not. But I love the story because it just points to, yes, our minds can be developed or trained to relate in skillful ways. And if we don't quite become great haiku poets, we might at least develop and strengthen the quality of equanimity. That realizing that lots of things happen in our lives. Some we enjoy, some we don't. Have we developed a capacity to hold all of that without adding more mental suffering to the situation? So this is particularly revealing, and it has been for me in my practice. Can be going along, and for whatever reason, there's some suffering in my mind, which really means some difficult emotion. It might be frustration or sadness or anger or desire or anxiety, or there's a whole long list of them. So when I'm either in formal practice or just in my life, when something comes up that's disturbing, my mind is no longer at ease. By don't waste your suffering, I mean, don't deny it or try to push it away. Don't avoid it. Don't waste your suffering means taking an interest in, okay, this unpleasant emotion is arising in me. Can I investigate it? Can I explore it? Not only can I explore the energy of the emotion itself, taking interest. Oh, anger feels like this, or sadness feels like this, or anxiety feels like this. When we have that interest, in those moments, we're not particularly identified with that emotion. We're actually being mindful of it. And so we learn something. And then we also want to check out what is the attitude in our mind about this emotion. So just as an example, suppose there's anxiety. Do we just have aversion to it and not like it and try to get rid of it in whatever way we can? Or if we're checking the attitude in our mind, we say, oh, there's aversion here. And then settle back into that quality of acceptance. The ability to open to it, to feel it without reactivity. So many years ago, the most afflictive emotion that was coming up for me in my practice was fear. And it wasn't fear about anything in particular. It was just like free-floating fear, but it was really strong. I'm working with it for a long time. Noting it, fear, but it just felt locked in. And then at a certain point, and this took a long time for me to realize, I was doing some walking meditation, the fear was coming up, but then something switched. And that switch was reflected in the thought, if this fear is here for the rest of my life, it's okay. It's okay. And I realized that was the first moment in all of that time that I was truly accepting of it. Because even though I had known it was there and I was noting it, it was not being mindful. And it highlighted the difference for me between recognition and mindfulness. And we often confuse the two. We think if we're recognizing what's there, it means we're being mindful. But that's not necessarily so. We can be recognizing something through the filter of aversion or through the filter of attachment. Mindfulness means, yes, we do recognize what's there, but then that extra quality of acceptance, it's okay. So for me, it's okay became the magic mantra. Whatever I was going through, it's okay to feel this. It's okay. And that acceptance then made possible the real exploration of it. So I'm doing some editing as I'm talking because I could see we could be here for an hour and a half otherwise. Okay, so everything rests on the tip of motivation. So we explored that arena, whether it's through speech or any other activity we do. Don't waste your suffering, which means when we are suffering in some way, that is a fantastic opportunity to understand on a deeper level the patterns of our conditioning and what's causing the suffering and ways of letting go. So there's one more arena of investigation. Again, in response to the question, why meditate? And the Buddha highlighted this so often in his teachings. The importance and many implications of seeing impermanence on more and more refined levels. How do we relate to the simple fact that whatever has the nature to arise will also pass away? And what has the nature to arise? Everything. So everything has the nature to arise and therefore will pass away. So I recently, a couple of years ago, I came across a phrase in the text which I had not, I had just overlooked. I hadn't come across before, but it highlighted this insight into impermanence. It made it more vivid, just in the language of it. It said, everything is always becoming otherwise. It's kind of an unusual phrase in English, but because of that, it just highlights, everything is always becoming otherwise, changing. So I could be going for a walk and, I don't know, maybe I get a twinge in my knee. And now, becoming otherwise. Instead of, why did that happen? Whatever. Instead of ruminating about it all. No, it's just things becoming otherwise all the time. So there are two phrases which encapsulate this understanding. One is a phrase that I've used a lot. Anything can happen anytime. Right? Things are not as stable as we would like them to be. Anything can happen anytime. Going along fine, feeling healthy, and all of a sudden, some illness arises. I mean, there are countless examples of anything can happen anytime, and sometimes it's really good things that can happen at any time. The other phrase, which the Buddha emphasized in one powerful reflection, which he said that we should really cultivate or practice every day. He gave emphasis to this reflection for the deepening of our practice. So he said, this is what we should reflect on. Whatever has the nature to grow old will grow old. Whatever has the nature to become ill will become ill. And whatever has the nature to die will die. This is just nature. But here's the tagline. And I am not exempt. And I have found that to be such a powerful reminder. Because as we go through our life with various expressions of becoming older and becoming ill, and maybe even in a dying process, and I see it in myself, even with little things, even though intellectually I know I am not exempt, I can see in myself that deep feeling, well, I should be exempt. It's refusal to acknowledge the Dharma of all of this. It's just nature. It's just the law. It's not a mistake. But if we don't attend to that, then we get attached to things staying the way we want them to stay, the way we like them. If we're attached to summer, how do you feel in winter? If we're attached to youth, how do you feel as you're getting older? If you're attached to health and vigor, how do you feel when you become ill? It's so clear that if we are not aware in a living way, not in a theoretical or intellectual way, but if we're actually living and practicing this, that things are always becoming otherwise, and we are not exempt. As we integrate that more and more deeply in our understanding in our lives, then we navigate all these changes with much greater ease. So all of this comes out of a refinement of perception of change. So one question that might arise at different times. So we may wonder, when we hear all this, if everything's changing all the time and everything's always becoming otherwise, what's the point of doing anything? Having relationships or striving for goals or working for the good. if everything is always in flux, what becomes the motivation, for our acting in skillful ways? So there are a couple of distinctions which are very helpful to understand in our lives and also specifically in our meditation practice. So the first is understanding the difference between attachment and commitment. Attachment means we want something to stay the way it is. Whether it's a relationship, whether it's some pleasant experience, attachment or clinging stay this way. Of course, that's impossible. Commitment means that we can have a steadiness towards an aspiration, towards a goal, through all the changes. Right? So the commitment can be there. I'll give you an example. And this relates to another distinction, which is between expectation and aspiration. So an aspiration, basically it sets the goal for our practice, for our lives. We aspire to become more aware. We aspire to become more compassionate. We aspire to be more generous. So the aspiration sets the direction and the goal. Expectation means that we want things to be the way we want them when we want them. So a good example of this, which I've experienced countless times in my practice, I can be having a sitting and what we would call, not in a very skillful way, but we all do it, I would have what I call a good sitting. So what we think is good really means it's pleasant. Right? So we're having a good sitting. The mind is somewhat concentrated. The body feels at ease. It's all going along very smoothly. And then we think, finally, I got it. Right? Finally, I got this meditation thing. And we get up and we can't wait to come back to the next sitting. The very next sitting, we can sit down and the mind is restless or it's bored or there's pain in the body. Things are always becoming otherwise. We can have the aspiration to greater ease, greater clarity, greater understanding, with the understanding that there will be endless ups and downs. It's like a sine curve, up and down and up and down, but the slope of the curve is going up. Attachment or expectation is trying to fix things, which is counter to the understanding of the great truth of change. So I just want to say a few words. I couldn't let a talk go by without referring to an example at all. Kind of the last area of exploration and answer to the question, why meditate, has to do with something which is very subtle, hard to understand, really counterintuitive. It goes against our common understanding of things. And that is the Buddhist teaching on selflessness or non-self. We have the idea, commonly, that there is some essential self, someone behind all experience to whom it is happening. And that's the I. That's the self. And this felt sense of self is deeply habituated. Right? Our lives revolve. Our lives revolve around it. So it would be worth investigating. We're worth investigating if there, as the Buddha taught, if there is no self, no permanent being to whom things are happening, then it would be interesting to explore, well, how does that felt sense come about? Because it's so prevalent, it's so predominant. How does it arise in the first place if it's not there? So understanding how it arises is not complicated. It arises whenever there's identification with the momentary experience. A thought arises. I'm thinking. Right? Or my thought. We're identifying with it. Or different emotions. Love, anger, fear, joy. I'm angry. I'm fearful. I'm joyful. With all of these, the I is extra. Each of these experiences, whether thoughts, emotions, feelings in the body, they're all arising impersonally due to various causes and conditions, manifesting their own nature and passing away. So it's love that loves. It's fear that fears. It's joy that joys. The thought is the thinker. There's no I behind it. It's not that they are referring back to a self. They're just arising due to the various conditions, manifesting their nature, passing away when the conditions change. But we're so habituated to identify with all of this phenomena. And it's that identification which creates that very deeply felt sense of self. So our practice really takes us to tremendous depth of understanding, to a transformative way of understanding what this whole process is about. It's important to understand that this is not just a philosophic inquiry, although it is also interesting on that level. But it's a way of understanding that we can free our hearts and minds from the clinging and attachment and identification that is the cause of suffering in ourselves and other people. And through this understanding, and this is what may be unrecognized for a while, this understanding of the selfless, impersonal nature of phenomena leads directly to a compassionate engagement with the world. And there's a teaching by Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, who was another of the great Tibetan masters. And this is a teaching which it inspires me so much. He said, when you recognize the empty, selfless nature of phenomena, then the energy to bring about the good of others dawns uncontrived and effortless. So I love that. It's like compassionate activity is the manifestation of the realization, the understanding of the empty, selfless nature of phenomena. And so one little phrase I like, compassion is the activity of emptiness. And so we just bring together this transformative realization about our own experience, about the nature of our own minds and body, and see how that directly manifests in terms of caring and compassion for the world. So all of this is really in response to the question, why meditate? So I hope some of this resonated with you and maybe help, to create some areas of interest for further exploration. Let's sit for just a couple of minutes, let all the words settle. May all beings everywhere be at peace. Thank you all from the East Coast. Hope you continue to have a wonderful, revealing rest of retreat. It is a fantastic thing to be doing. It's really a privilege to have the opportunity to be doing it. So, many good wishes.